The bridge and the battle begins. First, subscribe to my channel, HOA Stories Baby, and show some support, darling. The morning sun bled through a haze of mist over the quiet community of Maple Creek Estates. Neatly trimmed lawns lined the streets like obedient soldiers, each one identical to the next. Symmetrical hedges, beige mailboxes, and driveways so spotless they looked unnatural. To most, it was a picture of suburban perfection. To Judge Samuel Miller, it was a prison disguised as a neighborhood. He hadn't moved there for the community. He'd moved there for the land. A 2-acre property, backed by a winding creek that shimmered like a ribbon of glass behind his home. It was his sanctuary after decades of courtroom battles. The only place where he didn't have to wear the robe or keep his anger chained. For years, Miller had tolerated the Homeowners Association, their endless letters, their smug reminders about uniform property standards, their obsession with paint shades and lawn height. He'd endured it all, but the day they targeted something personal, something he built with his own hands, that was the day everything changed. The Bridget had started innocently. The creek behind Miller's property was beautiful, but treacherous after a storm. One evening, while returning from the far side of his land, he slipped on the muddy bank and nearly tore his knee. That's when he decided to build a small wooden bridge. Sturdy, simple, perfectly legal. He measured every inch himself, filed a permit with the county, and ensured it sat entirely within his property line. It wasn't some flashy construction. Just a solid bridge with stone supports and oak planks that matched the tone of his deck. It gave him easy access to the other half of his yard, where he often sat with his old dog and read court documents in peace. But peace never lasts long when an HOA is involved. A week after completion, Miller found a letter shoved under his front door. Bold red letters stamped across the top. Notice of violation. Unauthorized structure over community waterway. He had almost laughed when he read it. The community waterway? That creek had existed long before the subdivision, before the HOA, before half the board members were even born. It was listed clearly on the original property deeds. Private stream access. He pulled out his documents, checked again, and smirked. He was right, but the HOA didn't care about right. They cared about control. The warnings begin. At first it was petty. A board member, Karen Dempsey, a retired realtor with a superiority complex, showed up at his door one morning. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with fake courtesy, "your bridge doesn't comply with our neighborhood aesthetic. It looks rustic." He stared at her. "It's a bridge, Mrs. Dempsey, not a decoration." "It's not about the purpose," she continued, glancing past him toward the backyard. "It's about harmony. Every addition must match the neighborhood's uniform style. You can't just put something up because you feel like it." He folded his arms. "I followed the county codes, filed the permit, and stayed within my property lines. Unless you're part of the county zoning department, this is none of your business." Her smile faltered. "Well, the board disagrees. You'll be fined if it's not removed within 30 days. He didn't respond. He simply closed the door. Slowly, deliberately, right in her face. That was his first mistake, at least in their eyes. The HOA thrived on submission. The moment someone refused to bow, they made it personal. The harassment campaign, over the next month, letters started piling up, each one more aggressive than the last. Second notice of non-compliance. Final warning before escalation. Community enforcement action pending. He ignored them all. Then came the fines. First $250, then $500, then $1,000. They added administrative fees, inspection costs, even legal expenses, though no lawyer had been involved yet. Neighbors began whispering. He could feel their eyes when he drove by, could see the flick of blinds when he walked his dog. The HOA had started their smear campaign, telling people he was hostile, uncooperative, damaging property values. One afternoon, a flyer appeared in every mailbox. Community update. Unauthorized construction near Creek. The HOA board is working diligently to restore neighborhood harmony and environmental safety compromised by a homeowner's unapproved structure. No names mentioned, but everyone knew who they were talking. About the final straw a month later, Miller returned from a 3-day court conference. As he turned down his street, something felt wrong. The creek looked different. He parked, walked around to the backyard, and froze. His bridge was gone, not damaged, not vandalized. Gone. The planks were ripped out, the stone supports smashed, the soil along the bank torn up by machinery. Fresh tire tracks cut across the grass. The creek water ran murky with mud and debris. For several seconds, he just stood there, silent, stunned, his jaw tightening with every passing moment. Then, slowly, he felt it. That deep, boiling anger he usually reserved for the courtroom, when someone lied under oath. He clenched his fists. They didn't even have the courtesy to notify him. No legal notice, no due process, just destruction. On the remains of one of the stone supports, he found a laminated paper, taped crudely. HOA enforcement notice. Unauthorized structure, removed under Section 14B. Community Environmental Protection Act. Cost of removal to be billed to homeowner. They had billed him to destroy his own property. That was the moment the switch flipped. The calm before the storm. That night, Miller sat at his desk, the room dim except for the glow of his desk lamp. He opened a folder, Maple Creek HOA, and began sliding in documents one by one. Photos of the bridge before and after, permit copies from the county, the property deed showing the creek boundary, every single threatening letter. The HOA's environmental claim, which had no legal standing. He didn't pace. He didn't shout. He simply worked in silence, his jaw locked, his eyes cold. To anyone else, it looked like calm. But to those who knew him, that silence meant danger. Miller wasn't just a homeowner. He was a federal judge. And the HOA had just committed trespassing, destruction of private property, and abuse of authority under state and federal law. The irony burned. These petty tyrants, so obsessed with rules, had no idea they'd just broken the very laws they claimed to uphold. The next morning, the following morning, he walked straight to the HOA office. It was a small building beside the community pool. Glass doors, smiling receptionist, the illusion of civility. When he stepped inside, the chatter died instantly. Karen Dempsey sat behind the counter sorting papers. She looked up and froze. "Mr. Miller," she said cautiously, "if you're here about the bridge—" "I'm here about my property," he interrupted. His voice was calm, but heavy. "Who authorized the demolition?" The board made a unanimous decision after environmental consultation, she replied quickly. It was posing a hazard to— Stop. His tone cut through the room. I reviewed every environmental regulation this state has. That bridge was perfectly legal. You entered private land, destroyed private property, and falsified authority. You better have a lawyer. Her face went pale. Sir, we acted under community policy. I don't care about your policy, he snapped. Your policy doesn't override the law. He turned and walked out. No threats, no raised voice, just a statement of fact. Karen sat frozen for several seconds before whispering to another board member. He can't actually sue us, right? The other member didn't answer. The calm fury back home, Miller stood at the edge of the creek, staring at the muddy water flowing where his bridge once stood. He wasn't sad anymore. He was focused. He had seen arrogance destroy men's lives in court. CEOs, officials, criminals, who thought rules didn't apply to them. Now it was time for the HOA to learn the same lesson. He picked up his phone and made one call. Andrew, he said when his clerk answered, I need you to pull every HOA-related case filed in this district in the last 5 years and get me the county's property code enforcement officer on record. Yes, sir, came the reply. Everything okay? Miller's voice was low. Not for them. The turning point. That night, as the community settled under its artificial calm, Miller prepared his retaliation. His printer hummed, his desk filled with documents. He wasn't just gathering evidence. He was building a case. When the HOA destroyed his bridge, they thought they'd humiliated a stubborn old man. What they had really done was provoke a federal judge into war. He smiled faintly as he stacked the files. They wanted harmony, he muttered. Let's see how harmonious they feel in court. The legal hammer drops. The HOA board thought the verdict was the end. They thought a public apology and a fine would settle everything. They thought Judge Samuel Miller would take his victory quietly and fade back into obscurity. They were wrong. For Miller, this wasn't about money anymore. It was about principle, about power, and about teaching people like the Maple Creek HOA what happens when arrogance meets the law. The calm before the second storm weeks passed. The bridge reconstruction began, funded directly by the HOA's drained reserve account. Contractors worked nervously, aware that every nail they drove was part of a federal court order. Neighbors watched silently as Miller supervised the project himself. Clipboard in hand, eyes sharp, every motion measured. He didn't speak much, didn't gloat, but everyone felt the pressure in the air. Even nature seemed to hold its breath when he walked by. Across the street, former HOA president Richard Langford sat on his porch, watching through narrowed eyes. His empire, his perfect little dictatorship, was gone. He had ruled the community for years, dictating lawn heights and mailbox colors. But one bridge had burned it all down, and still, Miller wasn't done. The investigation expands. The lawsuit had opened a Pandora's box. During discovery, Miller's legal team uncovered a decade's worth of questionable HOA activity. Unrecorded funds, forged homeowner signatures, and mysterious maintenance fees that didn't match bank records. Every page revealed a new layer of corruption. Miller read through the documents like a surgeon dissecting a tumor. They've been stealing from their own residents, he said quietly, hiding behind fake policies, fake votes, fake rules. He picked up his pen and wrote a single note on the file. Refer to Federal Fraud Unit. Within days, federal investigators were reviewing the HOA's finances. What began as a civil dispute had become a criminal probe. Langford received a letter that froze his blood cold. Notice of investigation. Financial misconduct allegations. The board's desperation panic spread through Maple Creek Estates like wildfire. Karen Dempsey's car disappeared from her driveway. The treasurer resigned overnight. The HOA office shut down temporarily, citing restructuring, but it was too late. The storm had already landed. Local news picked up the story. Federal judge sues HOA, exposes widespread misconduct. Homeowners demand answers as Maple Creek board collapses. Miller didn't talk to reporters. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any statement. Langford, however, couldn't stay silent. He called a local journalist, desperate to salvage his image. "It was just a misunderstanding," he pleaded. "We acted in the community's best interest." But when the reporter asked about the missing funds, Langford hung up. The court strikes again. A month later, the second hearing commenced, this time for civil damages and compliance enforcement. The courtroom was packed. HOA members sat in the back, whispering nervously. Reporters filled the benches. The air smelled of tension and polished wood. Judge Hamilton presided once again, gavel in hand, his expression unreadable. Miller sat at the plaintiff's table. Calm, collected, deadly. The HOA's new attorney, a young, inexperienced lawyer, clearly in over his head, shuffled nervously through his papers. When the hearing began, Miller's attorney presented a new motion. "Your Honor, the plaintiff requests full restitution of all court costs, bridge reconstruction oversight, and mandatory transparency audits for all HOA board activity for the next 5 years. Hamilton raised an eyebrow. "You're asking for federal oversight of a homeowners association?" "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied. "Given their consistent misconduct, it's the only way to ensure compliance." The defense tried to object, but every argument collapsed under evidence. Financial discrepancies, forged documents, photos, even witness testimony from former board members. One after another, they admitted guilt. By noon, it was over. Judge Hamilton's gavel struck once, echoing through the room like a gunshot. "The plaintiff's motion is granted in full." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. The Maple Creek HOA had just been placed under federal supervision. The public fallout. Within days, the media went into overdrive. Headlines read, "HOA placed under federal oversight after judge's lawsuit. Homeowners celebrate justice at Maple Creek. Miller became an unintentional hero." Letters poured into his mailbox. Not from fans, but from victims of HOA abuse across the country. People shared horror stories of illegal fines, property damage, and harassment. For the first time, he realized how deep this problem ran. He began keeping a folder labeled HOA Abuse, National Cases. Inside, he collected every letter, every story, every plea for help. "This isn't just about me anymore," he murmured. Langford's downfall. Meanwhile, Langford's life was collapsing. His accounts were audited. His reputation was shattered. His name became synonymous with corruption and stupidity. He tried to sell his house, but no one wanted to buy property in a federal supervised HOA. He applied for a job in another community association. Rejected. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. "You're that guy who tore down a judge's bridge, right?" They'd say. He stopped going out altogether. One night in a drunken haze, he wrote an email to Miller. "You ruined my life. I hope you're happy." Miller read it once and deleted it without reply. He wasn't happy. He was satisfied. The rebuild by spring, the new bridge stood complete. Stronger, more elegant, and reinforced with stone foundations. The builders had followed every legal code to perfection, terrified of making a mistake under Miller's supervision. On the day it was finished, the contractor handed Miller the final inspection form. "All cleared, sir. Structurally flawless." Miller nodded. "Good. Leave the invoice with the HOA office. They'll handle payment, if they still exist." He walked across the bridge slowly, feeling the wood creak gently beneath his boots. The sound was soothing, rhythmic, like justice breathing. On the far side, a small bronze plaque gleamed in the sunlight. It read, "Rebuilt by order of the United States District Court." The statement. That evening, Miller held a brief press conference outside his home. He didn't usually entertain the media, but this case had become bigger than him. He stood before the cameras, calm but fiery, his voice steady as stone. This case was never about a bridge. It was about authority. Too often, HOAs act without accountability, treating residents as subjects rather than citizens. The law exists to protect people from precisely that kind of overreach. And let this be clear. No organization, no board, no individual is above the law. The statement went viral overnight. It became a rallying cry for homeowners everywhere. A new beginning. Weeks later, as the dust settled, Miller received a call from Washington. A senator had seen the case and wanted him to advise on national HOA reform legislation. He accepted. At the same time, the Department of Housing and Urban Development opened a national review of HOA governance practices. Partly inspired by his case, Miller's Bridge had become a symbol, not of defiance, but of justice standing its ground. The final blow. Before closing the file for good, Miller requested one last court order, something personal. He asked that the HOA be required to host an annual community legal education seminar, teaching homeowners their rights under federal law. Judge Hamilton approved it, and so, every year, Maple Creek Estates would gather in the community hall, sit beneath fluorescent lights, and listen to lawyers explain why what they did was wrong. A permanent reminder carved into the neighborhood's calendar. The once proud HOA board was now a cautionary tale. Epilogue of Part 3 that night. After everyone had left, Miller walked to his backyard once more. The bridge glowed under the moonlight, water whispering below. He rested his hand on the railing and exhaled deeply. For months, anger had fueled him, but now, there was peace. Not the peace of silence, but the peace of justice delivered. He whispered softly to the night, "You don't get to break the law just because you hold a clipboard." The wind rustled the trees in reply. For Maple Creek, it was the end. For Miller, it was only the beginning. HOA faces. Federal consequences. The morning of the hearing felt heavy. The kind of day when the air itself seemed to carry judgment. The HOA board members arrived one by one, their faces pale, their voices tight with anxiety. They had strutted around the neighborhood like kings for years, but now every step toward that federal courthouse echoed with guilt. Behind those mahogany doors, they weren't the ones giving orders anymore. They were defendants, and across the aisle sat the man they had underestimated, Judge David Miller. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Local reporters filled the benches, cameras ready, pens scratching across notepads. The case had exploded in the media. HOA destroys federal judge's private bridge. The irony alone was enough to draw national attention. Miller entered quietly. No entourage, no display of authority, just calm, deliberate steps. But his presence filled the room like a storm about to break. He didn't wear his robe today. He didn't need to. Across the aisle, the HOA president, Gregory Hines, avoided eye contact. His hand shook as he whispered to the association's lawyer, a sharp-tongued man who had suddenly realized he was far out of his league. Hines had built his entire reputation on controlling others, on threatening fines, on bullying homeowners into submission. But standing there, under the glow of the courtroom lights, he looked like a man about to be crushed under the weight of his own arrogance. The judge presiding over the case, a colleague of Miller's named Judge Rena, began proceedings. Case number 24, FC 1987, David Miller versus Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Those words alone sent a ripple through the room. For the first time, the HOA realized the gravity of what they had done. They hadn't just messed with a resident. They destroyed the property of a federal judge. Miller's attorney rose first, a young woman named Rachel Torres, fierce and articulate. She didn't waste time. She laid out the evidence, the permits, the property lines, the drone footage showing HOA-hired workers cutting through the bridge supports with saws. Then she played the audio recording. Hines's voice, calm and smug, saying, "If he doesn't comply, we'll just handle it ourselves." The courtroom went dead silent. Reiner leaned forward. "Mr. Hines, is that your voice?" Hines swallowed hard. It sounds like it, Your Honor, but..." Rainer's hand came down with a bang. "Answer the question." "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered. The silence that followed was suffocating. Miller didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed locked on Hines, cold and steady. A man watching justice unfold in the slowest, most satisfying way possible. Rachel continued. The HOA not only trespassed on private land, they willfully destroyed federal property, since Judge Miller's land and bridge fall under federal jurisdiction due to an easement crossing. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Reiner adjusted his glasses. "Federal property," Rachel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The HOA's demolition team cut into a waterway protected under federal code. The act constitutes an illegal alteration of a navigable stream under Title 33. Reiner's expression hardened. Now it wasn't just civil damages. It was federal crime territory. The HOA lawyer tried to interject, stumbling through a defense about miscommunication and neighborhood safety. But the words fell flat. Every photo, every witness statement, every timestamp told the same story. Deliberate, arrogant destruction. At one point, Hines tried to speak directly. "We were just trying to maintain community standards. The bridge, it didn't match the neighborhood look." Reiner slammed his gavel. "You broke into a judge's property, ordered a demolition, and now you're concerned about aesthetics?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs again. The HOA's defense unraveled completely. Their treasurer admitted she'd warned Hines not to proceed without legal approval. Their secretary testified she'd seen the letter from the city, confirming the bridge was legal, and the demolition crew leader confirmed they'd been told to get it done before he finds out. It was over. Reiner leaned back, steepled his fingers, and exhaled through his nose. "Mr. Hines," he said slowly, "your board has acted with gross misconduct, abuse of power, and violation of both state and federal law." Miller's face remained still, but inside, his anger pulsed like a storm behind glass. He didn't want them just fined. He wanted accountability, something they could never hide from. Reiner continued, "This court hereby orders the Oak Ridge HOA to pay full restitution for property damages, emotional distress, and all associated legal fees. Furthermore, due to the federal infraction, the board will be referred for criminal investigation under Section 1362 of Title 33. Gasps filled the room. The HOA lawyer tried to protest, but Reiner's gavel cut him off. "In addition, I am ordering an immediate freeze on the association's operational funds pending audit. You will cease all enforcement actions until this investigation concludes." The HOA board sat frozen, faces pale, lips dry. Their empire of petty control had collapsed in a single morning. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Flashbulbs flickered. Miller didn't look at the cameras. He simply gathered his papers, thanked Rachel, and walked out with calm precision. No words, no celebration, just quiet justice. But as he reached the courthouse steps, Rachel caught up with him. "David," she said, "they'll be ruined after this." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "They should be," he said. "They used power to destroy something they didn't understand. Now they'll learn what real power looks like." That evening, the HOA headquarters looked like a disaster zone. Members shouted at each other. The insurance company refused to cover their damages. The policy didn't include illegal acts. Gregory Hines sat alone in his office, staring at the letter from the federal court, the one that froze their accounts. He'd lost everything: his reputation, his authority, his control. When he stepped outside, he saw Miller walking his property. Calm, collected. The new bridge construction was already underway, but it wasn't the side of the bridge that broke Hines. It was the silence, the quiet knowledge that he'd gone to war with a man who understood the law better than anyone alive. He called out weakly, "You got what you wanted, Miller. Are you happy now?" Miller turned slowly, his eyes sharp as steel. "No," he said, "not yet." Then he walked back toward his house, the sunset cutting across his face like fire. The HOA board members stood at their windows, watching him in silence. Not as a neighbor, but as a reminder of the law they thought they could bend. And as night fell over Oak Ridge, whispers spread. The community that once feared the HOA now feared something else entirely: consequences. But the story wasn't over yet. Miller had one last move to make, something that would turn his victory into legend. And that's where part 5 begins. The New Bridge and Sweet Revenge. The New Bridge and Sweet Revenge. For weeks after the verdict, the Oak Ridge neighborhood felt like a battlefield. After the smoke cleared, the lawns were neat, the mailboxes polished. But the people who had once strutted around giving orders now avoided each other's eyes. The HOA office lights stayed off. Notices stopped appearing on doors. The power that had ruled the community with fines and threats had vanished overnight. Judge David Miller didn't celebrate in public. He rose every morning before sunrise, coffee steaming in his hand, and stood on the edge of his property where the bridge had once stood. The creek below still whispered against the stones, patient, waiting. To outsiders, it looked like an empty span of water. To him it was the scar of arrogance. He had no intention of leaving it that way. Rebuilding. The construction trucks arrived a week later, legally approved, fully permitted, and paid for by the frozen accounts of the Oak Ridge HOA. Every hammer strike echoed across the valley like judgment. Neighbors came out quietly, pretending they were just taking walks. But everyone knew they were there to watch history being rebuilt. Miller oversaw every inch of the process. "Make the foundations deeper," he ordered. "They'll never tear this one down again." The foreman nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. The new bridge rose slowly, steel reinforced, designed to last generations. No more delicate wood panels. This one was stone and iron, elegant yet immovable. At its base, he planned a small plaque. It wasn't vanity. It was a reminder. Rebuilt by order of federal court. Justice served. The workers set it in place with care. When Miller ran his fingers over the engraved letters, he didn't smile. His anger hadn't faded. It had simply cooled into precision. He wanted the HOA to see that bridge every day, to know exactly who had rebuilt it, and under whose authority. The HOA's collapse. While the bridge rose, the HOA fell apart. Gregory Hines resigned publicly after the audit revealed mismanagement of funds. 2 other board members followed. Their names dragged through headlines. The HOA's once proud sign was taken down by the city because the organization had lost its charter. Without insurance or operational funds, Oak Ridge HOA was legally dissolved. Miller didn't need to say a word. Justice had done the talking, yet whispers continued. Some neighbors claimed they saw Hines sitting alone at the now empty community office, staring out at the road that led past Miller's property. Others said he sold his house at a loss and disappeared. The truth didn't matter. The legend already had a life of its own. The ceremony, when the new bridge was finished, the workers invited Miller to take the first walk across. The sun hung low, gold spilling over the water. The whole neighborhood gathered at a distance, curiosity stronger than fear. Cameras flashed. Someone murmured, "He actually did it." Miller stepped forward, each footfall ringing against the fresh stone. Halfway across, he stopped and looked back at the crowd. His voice carried clearly over the creek. "This bridge isn't just mine," he said. "It belongs to every homeowner who's ever been bullied by power, masquerading as authority. Let it stand as a reminder. Laws protect people, not boards." Applause rose hesitantly, then grew until it filled the air. Some cheered because they believed in him. Others cheered because they wanted forgiveness. Miller didn't care which. All that mattered was the truth now carved in stone behind him. Aftermath weeks later, life in Oak Ridge began to normalize. But it wasn't the same. Without the HOA, neighbors started handling things together, repainting fences, organizing cleanup days, actually talking. It turned out the community ran smoother without the constant threat of fines and letters. Miller stayed out of their affairs. He wasn't interested in leadership. He already had enough of that in his courtroom. But his presence carried quiet weight. When disputes arose, people would glance toward his house, remember the bridge, and think twice. The plaque became a landmark. Joggers stopped to read it. Kids asked their parents what it meant, and every explanation came with the same moral. Don't misuse power. You never know who you're crossing. The visit one late evening, months after the rebuild. A car pulled up near Miller's driveway. Gregory Hines stepped out, older, thinner, carrying a small envelope. The sound of crickets filled the night. Miller met him halfway down the path, arms crossed. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. "I know," Hines muttered. "I just wanted to apologize." He extended the envelope. "This is what's left of my fine payment. I sold my house. It's not much, but..." Miller didn't take it. "Keep it," he said coldly. "You'll need it more than I do." Hines nodded, eyes down. "You got your revenge." "No." Miller replied. "I got justice. Revenge is what you tried to take from me when you tore down that bridge." Hines looked up, shame heavy in his eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Miller turned away. "That's the problem. You thought your power made you right." He walked back toward his house, leaving Hines alone in the moonlight. The bridge shimmered behind him, solid and silent, a monument to everything Hines had lost. Reflection. Later that night, Miller stood at the center of the bridge again. The creek murmured below, calm and endless. His anger, once volcanic, had cooled into a quiet satisfaction. The law had done what it was meant to do, not just punish, but teach. He took a deep breath. For the first time in months, he felt peace settle over him. Justice wasn't about noise. It was about balance. He traced the plaque with his fingers one last time, then smiled faintly. "You stood through fire," he whispered to the bridge. "Now stand for the truth." The wind carried the words downstream. Behind him, the lights in the houses flickered on one by one. Families, laughter, peace. The neighborhood finally felt like a community again, not because of rules, but because fear had been replaced with respect. Epilogue months later, a journalist visited to write a follow-up story. She asked Miller if he regretted anything. He paused. "Just one thing," he said. "What's that?" "That I let them push me that far, before I acted." "Sometimes silence gives power to bullies," she smiled. "And now?" "Now," he said, glancing at the bridge through the window. "Silence means peace." The article went viral. People across the country shared it as the Judge versus HOA story. Homeowners wrote letters thanking him. Some neighborhoods even voted to dissolve their HOAs after reading it. The story became legend. How one man's bridge brought down an empire of arrogance. And every morning, Judge Miller still crossed that bridge with the same steady stride. Coffee in hand, eyes calm, not in anger anymore, but in triumph. Because justice, once served, doesn't fade. It stands, solid, unshakable, like the bridge that carried his name. Discovering their huge mistake, the next morning, Maple Creek Estates looked deceptively peaceful. Birds fluttered over manicured lawns. Sprinklers hissed rhythmically. And the HOA president, Richard Langford, sipped his coffee on his porch as if nothing had happened. But in one particular house, the one with the freshly torn creek bank, a storm was brewing. Judge Samuel Miller was already awake, sitting in his study, surrounded by files, property maps, and legal statutes. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was methodical. Years of courtroom discipline had taught him that rage was best served cold, calculated, and backed by irrefutable evidence. And he had plenty. The evidence hunt. He started by reviewing his county permit. Dated, signed, and legally binding. It allowed him to construct a private pedestrian bridge within the limits of his property. Next came the survey maps, marked clearly with boundary lines. The creek sat entirely within his land. Then he reviewed the HOA's environmental claim. The phrase they'd used, Community Environmental Protection Act, didn't exist in any legal database. He searched the county's code, the state's environment department, even federal environmental law. Nothing. It was fabricated. He leaned back in his chair, lips tightening into a humorless smile. They made up a law, he muttered, to destroy my property. He highlighted every false statement in their documents. Violations of due process, abuse of authority, trespass, destruction of private property. The list grew longer by the minute. When he was done, he picked up his phone. Andrew, he said to his law clerk, I want you to draft an injunction. Title it Miller versus Maple Creek Homeowners Association. Grounds, illegal entry, property destruction, and fraudulent authority. Andrew hesitated. Judge, are you filing this personally? Miller's eyes burned. Damn right, I am. The HOA's panic. Meanwhile, at the HOA office, Richard Langford sat in a cheap leather chair, trying to look confident while reading the email from their treasurer. Mr. Langford, did we actually verify property lines before the bridge removal? Our contractor says he never saw a removal permit signed by the homeowner. If Miller complains, we might be in trouble, Langford scoffed. Trouble? He's a retiree. What's he going to do? Write a letter? Karen Dempsey wasn't so sure. He's not just some retiree, she said quietly. You know who he is, right? Langford frowned. Yeah, a former lawyer or something. No, Karen whispered. He's a federal judge. The color drained from Langford's face. You're joking. She shook her head slowly. I checked his name. He's on the federal judiciary website. For the first time since the demolition, Langford's confidence cracked. Oh hell. The warning letter. 2 days later, the HOA received an envelope. Thick, sealed, and stamped with the federal insignia. Inside was a letter so sharp it could have cut through steel. To the Maple Creek Homeowners Association Board, I am writing in reference to the unlawful demolition of a privately permitted structure located on my property, 114 Creekview Lane. Your actions constitute unauthorized entry, destruction of private property, and fraudulent enforcement of non-existent policy under the guise of HOA authority. You have 72 hours to provide documentation authorizing said demolition, including board meeting minutes, votes, contractor permits, and legal counsel approval. Failure to comply will result in immediate injunctive relief and a formal civil suit filed in the United States District Court. Homeowner Samuel T. Miller, federal judge when the board met to read it. Silence filled the room. Langford's hand trembled slightly as he held the paper. He's serious, he muttered. Karen leaned forward. What do we do? Langford exhaled slowly. We buy time. The cover-up. The HOA tried to scramble. They held an emergency meeting, secretly at Karen's house. They typed up fake minutes, claiming they had voted to remove the bridge for safety reasons. They forged a contractor authorization form. They even attempted to backdate an environmental report using an online template, but their panic made them sloppy. The fake report used a non-existent company name. The digital timestamps were wrong. Every document was a minefield of inconsistencies, and Miller saw right through it. When their response packet arrived, he didn't even have to flip through half of it before smirking. Fabricated, he said flatly. They just signed their own warrant. The legal strike. That same afternoon, he filed his motion. The case went directly to the federal district court under his colleague, Judge Hamilton. The complaint was brutal. 22 pages of evidence, complete with photographs, property maps, witness statements, and legal citations. He wasn't just accusing the HOA of misconduct. He was accusing them of systemic abuse of power and civil rights violations under the Fair Housing Act. Within 48 hours, the court issued a temporary restraining order, TRO, against the HOA, freezing all fines, penalties, and financial transactions pending investigation. The HOA's bank accounts were locked. Their lawyer, a smug suburban attorney named Paul Denton, called an emergency meeting. "This is bad," Denton said bluntly. Federal judges don't file personal lawsuits unless they have overwhelming proof. You people might have just buried yourselves. Langford tried to sound confident. "We can settle. Offer to rebuild the bridge." Miller declined immediately. "I'm not interested in settlements," he wrote. "I'm interested in precedent." The neighborhood turns word spread fast. Neighbors who once whispered behind Miller's back now crossed the street to avoid the HOA board members. The smug looks disappeared. The community's group chat exploded with questions. Wait, the HOA destroyed his bridge? Can they even do that legally? He's a judge. What were they thinking? Karen began avoiding the pool area altogether. Langford stopped jogging in the mornings. Even the landscapers whispered about the man who's suing the HOA. Miller didn't care about gossip. He only cared about results. The board crumbles. 3 weeks later, the board received subpoenas. Each member was called to testify. The HOA's insurance company refused to defend them, citing acts of intentional misconduct. Under the glare of court proceedings, cracks began to show. Emails leaked. Karen had written, "We should remove it quickly before he takes legal action. If he complains, we can just fine him again." It was over. Miller didn't even need to raise his voice in court. His attorney, a sharp civil litigator, simply laid out the evidence like dominoes. Every fake document, every lie, every abuse of HOA authority. When Langford tried to speak, the judge cut him off. "Did you enter this man's property without consent?" Langford hesitated. "We believed, answer the question." "Yes." The courtroom fell silent. The verdict. By the time the gavel fell, the HOA's fate was sealed. The court ordered immediate restitution for the destroyed bridge, $150,000 in punitive damages, suspension of the entire HOA board pending federal oversight. Langford's face drained of color. Karen burst into tears. Paul Denton quietly packed his files. He knew they were finished, but Miller wasn't done. He requested one final order, that the HOA publish a public apology to every homeowner, admitting fault and acknowledging their misuse of authority. The judge granted it. Within a week, a printed letter was mailed to every mailbox in Maple Creek Estates. The HOA Board of Maple Creek Estates formally apologizes to Judge Samuel Miller for the unauthorized destruction of private property. "We acted outside our authority and deeply regret our actions." The neighborhood was stunned. No one had ever seen an HOA humbled like that. Aftermath days. Later, Miller stood by the creek again. The debris had been cleared, the land quiet. For the first time in months, he felt calm. But under that calm, there was still fire. Not for revenge, but for justice. He knew this wasn't just about a bridge. It was about power. How easily small people abused it. when they thought no one could stop them. That night, he opened his laptop and began writing an article for the Federal Law Review titled Homeowner Associations and the Misuse of Authority, a Legal Perspective on Community Power. He ended it with one line: "When those entrusted with order misuse it, even the smallest bridge can become a battlefield of justice."